Good morning. I'm going to say good to see everyone this morning. And if y'all do notice, I do have glasses on. I've never wore glasses, so if I'm acting a little crazy with my glasses up here, it's because I've never worn them before. I'm trying to get used to them, and I didn't just get glasses. I got bifocals too, and they're really hard to get used to. But they do help. I fought them for several years. I needed them for a couple years now and fought getting them. But they do help me when I'm reading, and so maybe when I'm reading some of these names in the Old Testament, I won't butcher them like I have been, because all the letters are not just blending together. It look like just a big mush of letters. But anyway, so like I said, good to be here. If you have your Bible, turn to 2 Samuel, and we're gonna hit just the very last part of chapter number 11 before we get to chapter number 12. The very last part of chapter number 11, and I just read it last week, and I think it's something that we shouldn't just read, but we should think about. And so the very last part of chapter number 11, 2 Samuel. In verse number 27, the very last part, it says, "But the thing that David had done displeased the Lord." And I thought about it, and I wanted to just move on. I wanted to move on into chapter number 12. But I thought, that's not something that we should just skip over lightly. It's just in there. It's just one little sentence. It's not a big old long thing, Gil. It's not this huge long thing of how David offended the Lord. But you're actually going to see it when we get into chapter number 12. After Nathan the prophet talks to David, David said that he had sinned against the Lord. And I thought about that, because, for me, when I'm reading this, I'm like, well, really, you sinned against Uriah. You sinned against Bathsheba. That's who you sinned against. But ultimately, when you sin, you're sinning against the Lord. When you sin, you're sinning against God. When you sin, you're sinning against Christ. That's who you're sinning against. And I thought about in reference to, for us to reference it in our day and age, if you think about it, if you commit a crime and you go to court, if you go to criminal court, it's going to be, let's say you commit a crime here in Gordon County. It's going to be the state of Georgia. It's going to be the state of Georgia against, and whoever, put your own name in there. That's who it's going to be. Even though the crime may have been committed against another person, that the state of Georgia, because you broke the laws of the state of Georgia. You broke the laws of the state of Georgia. Now, we have civil court whenever it's a dispute between two people. We have civil court for that. But criminal court, when you break the laws of the state, even though maybe in breaking the laws of the state you committed a crime against another person, the state of Georgia is going to take that up on their behalf. And so I thought about that here it says the thing that David did displeased the Lord, and when David gets right with God, he has to acknowledge that his sin, he didn't say, I sinned against Uriah, I sinned against Bathsheba. He said, I sinned against the Lord. That's who I sinned against. That's who ultimately was the one that's offended. That's who ultimately is my judge. And that's who I have to make this right with. There was no way to make it right with Uriah. And with Bathsheba, he can only do the best he can. But with Uriah, he's not ever going to be able to make that right. But he had to get right with God. And so I thought about, there's a time period between where we're reading right here, and I know that it says right above that it says that she bore him a child. But we understand that from the time he committed adultery until the time that she had that child, there's a 9-month window right there. There's a 9-month window right there. And think about it, Brother Croft. There is a relationship with God that was broken For 9 months, and you really don't see it in here. You see the sin, you see the cover-up of the sin, which is what we talked about last week. But now here we are, we're in this window, we're in this area of time where there's not a lot being talked about, and you don't know what's going on in David's life until we get to the next chapter right here, after the child is born, where Nathan finally comes to him. And we'll look at that, and we may get to it this week. But I wanted us to think about what was going on in David's life. I mean, it obviously said the thing that David did displeased the Lord. And so we know that relationship, I mean, you can't be a man after God's own heart and not value the relationship you have with God. And so here is a man that was a man after God's own heart that had this relationship with God. From the time he was young, he had this relationship with God, and now that relationship, that fellowship is broken. That fellowship is broken. And just like, the class is filled up with mostly men in here, but just like when something, when you do something and your wife is upset with you, I was talking to a guy at work this week, and the thing is true, whether you want to admit it or not, but it's happy wife, happy life. When your wife's upset with you, you're not a happy man. You can't be a happy man because she makes sure you're not a happy man. And so it's happy wife, happy life. And so my wife's back there like, oh, really? I didn't realize I had that much over you. But I mean, the guy I was talking with, he said he was in the doghouse. Then he told me about being in the doghouse, and then he said it was just me and her this weekend, and the other kids were at their other parents because he's been divorced and remarried. And he said something happened, and he said immediately it irritated me, and I started to say something. And he said, I just got out of the doghouse. And I don't want back in that thing, so I'm not going to say anything. And so he had to overcome his natural reaction to be like, what's wrong with you? Because he said, I just didn't want back in there again. But I mean, you think about getting in the doghouse with God. I mean, that's what David was. David was in the doghouse with God. He was where, you can pray, but you know that God, even though he may hear you, he's not going to answer. He may hear you, but he's not going to answer. Why? Because he's only looking for one prayer. It's just like when you're lost. You can pray for all kinds of things when you're lost. But what is the prayer that God's looking for? That's the prayer when you come to him for salvation. That's the prayer that he's looking for. And when you're not right with God, when you have broken fellowship with God, the thing that he deals with you about is the thing that he wants you to get right about. And until you get that right, there's no reason for you to pray about other things. There's no reason for you to pray about the peace in Jerusalem. There's no reason for you to pray about other people. You have to get yourself right before you can do anything else with God. And so here in this time period, David did this thing that displeased God, and there was a long window, Gil, where we don't really know. We don't really know what all went on in David's life. And so it obviously appears to me because of the next chapter, like he continued to do the things he was supposed to do. And again, I know I mentioned it last week, but again, I mean, there are times when you know you're not right with God. You know you've done something, and yet you're going to come to church anyway. You're going to come to church, and you're going to sit in church, and you're going to sing songs. Fortunately, I sit up in the balcony. I don't have to sing. But you're going to sing songs, and you're going to. If someone calls on you and say, "Hey, I want you to pray," you're going to pray, and God's not hearing that prayer, and you're going to do everything that you're supposed to do, but you're just a robot. That's all you are. You're just doing the thing that you're supposed to do. But there's no feeling, there's no heart in it. Why? Because all the while hey, I've got to get this right. I've got to get this right. I've got to make this right. I've got to get this right. I have got to deal with this thing right here. And you can push God off and push God off and push God off and say no for, obviously, here's a man after God's own heart. A lot of times we think, well, it's like when you deal with your child, you deal with your child and this, they do something wrong and you deal with them, you correct them, however you correct them, and then you move on. But here God let David stew in this for 9 months. And there are people that have stewed in their sin. And again, we're looking at sin, but there are people that stew in their bitterness. There are people that just stew in their bitterness. They're upset. They're upset with God. They're upset with someone else. Someone did them wrong, and they stew in that. They just live in that and live in that and live in that and live in that, and it consumes them. It consumes them, and they can't get anything out of church. They can't get anything out of their Bible reading. They can't get anything out of their prayer time. They can't get anything out of their relationship with God. Why? Because that is the thing that's consuming them. And so here is this sin. This sin has consumed David. The cover-up has consumed David. The coldness of it, the callousness of it has consumed him, but yet he goes on like everything's okay. He just goes on like everything's okay. We can tell by his reaction to Nathan, like, hey, here's Nathan. And think about it. If you come into church and you're committing a sin, you're not right with God, you feel like the preacher's looking right at you. When he's preaching, he's like, this message is just for me. Every time he looks, when he's sitting up here on the podium, and he's not even looking at you, he's not even crossed his mind, but you feel like you're the only one he's looking at in that service. You feel like you're the only one. Why? Because God wants you to get right. God wants you to get right, and your conscience is telling you to get right, but yet you're holding back for whatever reason. And so here David is holding back. If you look in Psalm chapter number 32, again, like I said, there's a lot that's not said. But in Psalm 32, verse number 3, it says, "When I kept silence, my bones waxed old through my roaring all the day long. For day and night thy hand was heavy upon me. My moisture is turned into the drought of summer." So he said, again, like I said, just because we don't read it over here in 2 Samuel doesn't mean it wasn't going on. And David said, all the day long, that was all I thought about. That was all I thought about. And he said, my moisture is turned into the drought of summer. It was drying up his bones. And think about it. And again, I'm talking to people that understand that we're not perfect. I'm talking to people. We're not a sinless perfection church. We're not a church that teaches that you're going to be sinlessly perfect. And so if you teach, if you understand that you're not going to be perfect, you have to understand that there are going to be times you do things that you shouldn't do and should not have done, and you violate the laws of God. And just because we're saved, and just because we're once saved, always saved, and just because we are, we are not going to be judged by going to hell for those sins, there is a relationship factor that we have to take into account and we have to deal with. And when you sin, how do you get right? How do you get right? How do you make those things right? How do you get back in fellowship with God? And so here David is saying, God was afflicting him not on the outward person where people could see, but on the inward person. And I find that true. Sometimes the inward person comes out. Sometimes the inward person comes out where you just like, man, what is wrong with that person? They used to be a happy person. They used to be a go-lucky person. They used to just enjoy life. And now they're just a miserable human being. And eventually it comes out that there's sin in their life. There was sin in their life, and that sin that had drugged them down and caused them to do things that they were not supposed to be doing, and they were not right with God anymore, and it was coming out. It was coming out because they weren't happy anymore. They weren't in a good mood anymore. They were just mean sometimes. And you're like, what is wrong with you? and it's because God was drying them up from the inside, and it was coming out. And so if you look in Psalm chapter number 51, and we know that this is David's chapter where it says in the beginning, to the chief musician, the Psalm of David, when Nathan the prophet came unto him after he had gone in to Bathsheba. And so, but in verse number 8, it says, make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. And again, like I said, I mean, I don't know that physically he had broken bones, but I think spiritually speaking, he said the bones that you have broken, like these bones are broken. And if you've ever broke a bone, both my boys have broke their legs. I broke my nose, so it's a little bit different. But you break your leg, and when Bub broke his leg, actually I think both my kids, my wife makes fun of me because I told them, you'll fine, just walk it off. But anyway, you try and sit down on that thing, you can't sit down on it. Why? Because them bones are rubbing together, and they're hitting nerves that they're not supposed to hit, and it's tough on you. And David said, hey, God broke these bones, and I could not hear joy anymore. Why? Because all I could think about was these bones that were broken. I could not feel joy anymore. I could not feel gladness anymore. I did not enjoy my salvation. Obviously, we understand that salvation is something to enjoy. Salvation is, being forgiven of your sins is something that you should enjoy. But if you have violated the laws of God after you're saved, God's not just good with that and say, oh, well, he's still coming to heaven. God wants you to constantly be working on your relationship with God and constantly trying to be drawn near to God and Him drawing near to you. And whenever you veer off the path and follow the world, the flesh, and the devil, guess what? God has to deal with you to get you back on the path. And so he said, make me to hear joy and gladness, that the bones which thou hast broken may rejoice. Hide thy face from my sins and blot out all mine iniquities. Create in me a clean heart, O God. And so he said right there, he said, create in me a clean heart. And again, like I said, when you get saved, that burden rolls away and you feel clean. And I talked about it whenever we were talking about whether, whenever you're doubting your salvation. But when you sin, God has to deal with you. God has to deal with you. And there are different ways. Me and Dakota were talking about it yesterday. We were talking about just y'all's employees, Paul. We're talking about how you motivate people. Some people can be motivated like Bub. You just tell him, hey, so-and-so can nail faster than you, or he can carry more boards than you. And he's going to try and grab more boards, and he's going to try and carry more boards. But not everyone's like that, Ben. Some people you have to kind of baby them along, and you have to really just kind of have to just kind of push them along or pull them along, because you can't push them. But other people you can really jump on them hard and they'll take it. Other people you jump on them hard and they're going to be over in the corner. They're going to be over in the corner, and they're going to be sold up, and they're not going to work hard, and they're not going to talk. My dad had a guy, and it used to drive me crazy, because I said, Dad, every time you do this to him, he tears up more stuff than what you want done. But he'd get on to him, and he'd say something to him, and he'd just be ripping and tearing. But he'd get his work done fast. And that's all my dad was trying to do, was trying to motivate him to get his work done fast. But I'm like, Dad, every time he does it, he pokes a hole through the side of a trailer with the forklift or something like that. But my dad did it. He always did it to this guy. And even me as a young, I'm talking 10, 11, 12 years old, Brother Croft, I caught on to what my dad was doing, and this guy never caught on to what my dad was doing. But when you deal with people differently. And sometimes God has to deal with people differently. And so, but here he says, create in me a clean heart. Here, he said, look, David understood that his heart was dirty. He understood. And when you're saved, God cleanses you But then you go out and you commit a sin, and that sin makes you feel dirty again. Not that you're going to be lost, not that you're going to lose your salvation, but because you committed that sin, you feel dirty inside again. You feel dirty and filthy and condemned. Now, we know you're not going to go to hell. We know, you're not condemned to hell. But what happened? That relationship, that fellowship with God gets broken. And so you understand that to have fellowship with God, you need to be right with God. And to be right with God, you need to have a clean heart. And if you don't have a clean heart, you feel like you're not even worthy to have fellowship with God. You feel like I'm not even worthy to talk to God. But understand, again, just like I said, whenever we talk about how that God saved you, and He knew every single thing about you. He knew every single thing about you. He knew every sin you were going to commit before He saved you. He knew every single sin that you were going to commit after you got saved. He knew every one of those things. And He loved you, and He saved you anyway. And so understand that God understands that you're going to do these things. Now, He doesn't want you to do them. I'm not justifying saying go out and sin. You just go out and do whatever you want to, and it's all good. That's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying understand that God understands you're going to do them. He understands that it's going to happen. And when it happens, you're going to feel dirty, but He made a way for you to get right with God again and feel clean again. And so David said, hey, I have a dirty heart. For 9 months, David lived with a dirty heart. For 9 months, he had his sin where he thought it was covered up, but it wasn't covered up at all. But he felt like he covered it up through man's eyes, and so even though his fellowship was broken with God, he kind of just rolled along like that's all good. He said, create in me a clean heart and renew a right spirit within me. And I talked about it a minute ago. Again, sometimes, sin just tells on people. It just tells on people. Sometimes you're like, there's something not right. There's something not right. There's just a change in their spirit. There's a change in their attitude. There's a change in their walk. There's a change in their talk. There's something, I can't lay my finger on it. I can't come out and say it, but there's just something not right. Why? Sin does that to people. Sin causes that to happen in people where again, you're all in a turmoil on the inside. You're all in a turmoil on the inside, and it's hard to be on a turmoil on the inside and it not come out on the outside. And again, whenever this happens, you have choices. David hardened his heart for a little while. David hardened his heart, obviously, by what he did with Uriah. We know his heart was hard. But he hardened his heart for a little while. For 9 months, he had a hard heart. And no doubt it came out in Psalm chapter number 7. Psalm chapter number 7 right here. Here is, now this has nothing to do with this passage. But in Psalm chapter number 7, here is David, and I'll read the very first. It says, Shiggaion of David, which he sang unto the Lord concerning the words of Cush the Benjamite. And so again, I tried to find it up. I don't know who Cush the Benjamite is. I don't know who Cush the Benjamite is. I've read commentaries and people make speculation, but I don't know who Cush the Benjamite is. If you use your concordance and look up Cush, you're not going to find Cush the Benjamite. It's just not going to happen. And so anyway, but understand that it almost appears like it had something to do with Saul, and maybe Cush was a relative of Saul, which is what the commentaries think. And I'll point that out here in just a second. But in verse number 3, he said, O Lord my God, if I have done this, if there be iniquity in my hands, if I have rewarded evil unto him that was at peace with me, and I'm not an English person, so whatever that little funny mark means. Yea, I have delivered him that without cause is mine enemy. So he said, hey, I've delivered the person. I've tried to help the person that they're accusing, that without cause is my enemy. But look in verse number 4. If I have rewarded evil unto him that was at peace with me. And then verse 5, let the enemy persecute my soul and take it, yea, let him tread down my life upon the earth and lay mine honor in the dust, Selah. So again, sometimes your own words will come back to haunt you. Sometimes your own words will come back to haunt you. You have to be careful. I talked to Aaron and the kids the other day. Grady was out there. He was deer hunting. And he was Bambi hunting, and me and Aaron and the kids, we were inside, and so we were sitting there, and I read this to them the other day, and I talked to them about it. I said, I try not to be where I make myself this big paragon of virtue, and my father-in-law was really good about that too, was he made you understand he's just flesh like everyone else. Sometimes you see these preachers and you listen to these preachers and you look at them and they make themselves out like they've never sinned, they've never had a bad thought, they've never said they've never said anything out of character, anything like that. And I try not to be that. Now there's probably some times I have been, but the older I get, the more I realize that, and the more I realize that this is a battle. This is a battle, and the devil is out to get every single person sitting in this Sunday school class. He's out, and I understand that if he could take down a man after God's own heart, he could get me. If he could take down a man after God's own heart, and if a man after God's own heart could do the things that he did, yeah, I'm going to have to be really watchful. I'm going to have to be really careful. I'm going to have to really pay attention. And so here, you think about this. Here's David, and his words were said, if I have rewarded evil unto him that was at peace with me. Do y'all know anybody that David rewarded evil unto someone that was at peace with him? Yeah, I can think of somebody. He says, let the enemy persecute my soul and take it. Yea, let him tread down my life upon the earth and lay mine honor in the dust. I mean, think about it. Here's David, and he wrote this psalm, and we know that these psalms are songs that they sang. And think about it. Here, maybe one of David's other children said, Daddy, would you please sing me that song about when Cush the Benjamite? And he's like, oh, we're not singing that song. What? Yeah, we can't sing that song. Well, why not? I love to hear it. You sound so good whenever you sing it. Yeah, we're not going to sing that. Why? Because he didn't have a right spirit. He had a dirty heart, and those words were convicting words. Those words were convicting words. As he had to sing that psalm, those words would be convicting words, because when he wrote that psalm, he still had a clean heart and he had a pure mind, and he never dreamed that it was possible for him that he would do what he did. He never dreamed when he penned those words down, and for this psalm right here, that one day those words would come back to haunt him. And so, again, like I was saying, I have to be careful because, I raised my kids in church, and I tried to do right by my kids, and I had them in church their whole entire life, and we've never missed church, and we've never had a television, and I can start naming all the things that we have done and all the things that we haven't done, but I understand that the devil is out to get every one of my kids. And I can't stand up and be like, well, Paul, you've got little kids. If you just raise your kids like I raised my kids, your kids will turn out fine. I can't say that. Because I understand that my kids sitting up there in the balcony, every one of them have their own choice to make. I call them kids, but two of them are technically adults now. Bub got his voter registration thing in the mail the other day. He's going to get to vote. Not for Stacey Abrams, but he's going to get to vote here in a few weeks. He's going to get to vote. And so, I call them kids, but they're not kids anymore. I have one, and he's a he's a teenager, so he probably doesn't even appreciate being called a kid. And so he wasn't real happy with me whenever I told him that he was too old to get in the candy line. But, he got over it eventually. But you understand, he's not a kid anymore. But I understand that each one of my kids can take everything I taught them and say, I don't care about any of that. I'm not interested in any of that. Just like David said, even though he knew everything he was doing was wrong, and he did it anyway. He knew everything, and then he had a choice after he made the first mistake. He had a choice. He could have got right there, but he didn't. And let me say this, just because the preacher doesn't show up for 9 months later doesn't mean you don't need to get right until the preacher shows up. Once you realize you're wrong, that's the time to get right. Why? Because had David got right after he committed adultery, it would have been a whole lot less that he would have been held accountable for than had he went on in his sin and tried to cover up his sin. And like I said last week, sometimes the cover-up is actually worse than the sin. Even in God's eyes, we're going to see it where God's like, you killed Uriah. He doesn't even really mention that you committed adultery with Bathsheba. We know that the adultery is what led to the murder, but he said, you killed Uriah. And so understand that here David's own words are coming back to haunt him. So be careful that when you're up on the mountain, you get lifted up with pride and you're like, I'll tell you what, I'll never do this again. I'll never do that. You'll never see me. Just be careful. I think you should have those thoughts that that I want to be so dedicated to God that I'm not going to do these things. But be careful, because the devil's out to get each and every one of us. And in a moment of weakness, you just don't know how you're going to react. I thought about it. We in Georgia now, it's legal to hunt over bait. It's legal, so every guy in here that's on the Boneheads with Broadheads, text group that they have, that goes hunting. Every guy in here has spent enough money they could have bought a whole cow for what they spent in corn to bait these stupid deer in. Every one of them. Every time I look in the bed of Bub's truck, there's 3 or 4 bags of corn in the bed of his truck. And he'll get those emptied out a few weeks later. I'm like, Bub, you seen any deer? No, not seen any deer. Why not? Oh, my corn's gone. And so, they're baiting these deer in, and the deer are coming in, and the raccoons are coming in, and the squirrels are coming in. Me and Grady sat over it last night and watched it. But the more I hunt over bait, the more I realize that the devil does the same thing to each and every one of us. He puts the bait out, and I think I may have told y'all, but Brother John Westerfield preaches a message called "The Trapper Man," and it's one of the best messages you'll ever hear on understanding how the devil's out to get you and what he does. Now, there's one on sermon audio. It's not the best one. I heard him preach it at Brother Frazier's, and I wish I had the CD off of that instead of the one on sermon audio. But it's still good. But he said in there, he said, you'll never trap an animal that doesn't have an appetite. You never trap an animal that doesn't have an appetite. Why? Because that's what they use to bring them in to the trap. You just can't set a metal trap out there in the middle of somewhere and expect the animal to just walk through there. They'll see the trap and they'll walk around it. Grady got on to me yesterday because I didn't want to get eaten up by mosquitoes, so I sprayed off all over me, and he got upset with me when I got in the tree stand with him because he said, now the deer are going to smell us, and now the deer are not going to come in. And so we did see some deer, and they didn't come in, and so it's my fault because he swore that they smelled us. I'm not 100% convinced of that. But again, animals are smart. God gave them senses. Grady shot at one on Friday morning, and when he shot at that thing, even though it was young and probably never been shot at, as soon as he shot at it, that thing hit the ground, Gil, and the arrow went right over top its back. Boom. landed in the ground. It got up and run off, and it went right over its back. And when Grady went and got his arrow, it had some hair in it where it shaved the top of its back. They're smart. They're instinctive. They understand that they're the hunted. But sometimes their appetite overcomes their understanding that they're the hunted. And so they come in, and here's this corn, and we don't have any, we never planted any corn, Brother Croft. There's no reason for corn to be where that corn is. But the appetite for the corn overcomes the deer's senses to say, why, this is not a cornfield. This is the middle of the woods, and here's this giant pile of corn that smells like apples. Corn and apples don't smell alike, but here's this giant pile of corn that smells like apples. Wonder why this giant pile of corn that smells like apples just suddenly appeared in the middle of the woods. They don't say that. And so their appetite overcomes their senses, and they come up there and they stand, and they don't realize that 25 foot up in a tree, hanging from a tree, is a guy with a bow and arrow. And he's going to shoot at them and kill them. And so every time we go out and we sit in those things, Grady's sitting there hunting, and I'm sitting there, supervising, and even though he killed the deer without me, he still needs me sometimes. But you understand that here, we're out there and we're sitting over this bait, and I realize more and more as I get older that the devil does the same thing to each and every one of us. He learns your appetite. He learns what you have an appetite for. He learns what you'll tolerate and what you won't tolerate. And then he puts the bait out, and he just waits. I mean, he's not going anywhere, He's not going anywhere. He's got nothing else but time. And I understand it's not all, I'm not saying that the devil is personally on your case. Just like these lawyers that advertise 1-800-CALL-KEN, you're probably not getting Ken to take your case. But it's going to be someone that works for Ken that's going to take your case. But understand that he's out to get every one of us. And he's not just going to put a big sign out there and says, "Deer, stand here." That's not what we do. We just put the bait out there, and we sit out there and we wait, and we wait, and we wait. And if we don't get him today, Grady missed that one Friday morning. Guess what? He was back out there Friday evening, and he shot one Friday evening. No big deal to Grady. He missed one. Another one's going to come by, stand in the same pile, stand right in the same spot where the other one stood, and he got a shot at that one, and that one didn't duck as far as the other one, and that one is now in the cooler. And so you have to be careful. You have to be ever mindful that the things that you are drawn to, the things that you are being drawn to that are not of God, there's a very high probability they're nothing more than bait. Nothing more than bait, just to get you to take it. Just like, I talked about it. I talked about it where and I can't think of the name right now, but it completely drew a blank. But anyway, he taught Balaam. He taught them, he could not curse the children of Israel, but he told him, he said, hey, if you get them to commit sin, God will deal with them. If you get them, so what'd they do? They sent women in, and they committed fornication with those women, and then God had to deal with them. And the devil knows what your appetite is for. It may not be women. That may not be what your problem is. Obviously that turned out to be what David's problem was. That may not be what your problem is at all, but he knows what your problem is. He knows what you have an appetite for. He knows what you can be tempted with. And rest assured, he's going to tempt you with those things. And you have to decide, do I take the bait? I think back in my own life, there are multiple times where, and not just sin, but there are multiple times that the devil offered me a piece of brass when God had gold for me on the other side. Before me and my wife started dating, we'll be married 25 years this month. Before we started dating, the devil made me an offer, actually made me multiple offers for someone else who would not have been God's will for my life. And Brother Croft, I mean, it may have sounded good, it may have looked good to the flesh. It may have appealed to me. But what was it? The devil was offering me a piece of brass. It was nice and shiny and looked yellow like gold, but it wasn't gold. God had gold right on the other side. He had gold right on the other side. And I remember before I moved to Georgia, a man in my church came to me and said, hey, I'd already told my mom and dad I was leaving. If you'll come work for me, I'll train you. I'll pay for you to go to school. I'll put you in my shop, and I'll let you work my shop, and I'll let you do all the side work you want to in my shop. It was a pretty good offer. It was a pretty good offer, Brother Croft. But God's will was for me to move to Georgia. And so you have to be careful, because sometimes you'll get thrown a piece of brass that looks really good and it looks really shiny, but it's not the gold that God wants to give you. It's not the gold that God wants to give you. And so you have to be careful, because a lot of things are bait. Again, like I said, I mean, the deer never say, hey, why is this pile of corn that smells like apples out here in the middle of the woods where there are no apple trees and there are no corn cobs? There are no corn stalks. There's nothing here, but here's this big old pile of corn. They don't say that. And sometimes we, as humans who feel like we're so smart, we're so intelligent, we should be smarter than what we are, but we take the bait just like we're a deer that doesn't have any capacity in its brain like we do. And so here David took the bait, and then he followed up that bait by committing the sin, and then he tried to cover his sin, and then there was a long period where his fellowship was broken with God. There was that long window where his fellowship was broken with God. And inside, while that fellowship was broken, he was in turmoil. And you don't read it until he gets right with God. Then you read it. You read what was going on the inside. But all the while, he was trying to cover it up and make it look, he'd sing in the choir, if there was choir. If it was time for a feast or something like that, here was David. He was doing the things he was supposed to do and trying to make it look like everything was just fine. And all the while, he said, God, you've broken my bones. Fix my bones that are broken. Clean my heart. Renew a right spirit within me. All the while, all those things are internal things that maybe a few people saw, but not everyone saw. And so you have to be careful, because when you commit sin, the best thing for you to do is get right. Just get right. God knew you were going to do it. It's not like he's going to say, no, sorry, I can't forgive you. He's not going to say, I can't forgive you. He wants to forgive you, but you have to come to him and get right. And just because the preacher's not preaching on it, just because the Sunday school teacher doesn't say anything about it, just because when you turn your radio on, that's not the only thing you hear, being preached on, doesn't mean you don't already know inside your heart, yeah, I know. I need to get this right. And so if you are wrong, just get right. Don't try and cover it up. Cover it up makes it worse, not better. Don't try and keep going on. Make everyone, again, sometimes you just have to be humble. You just have to be humble and be like, yeah, I messed up. I messed up. I didn't want to. I didn't even think it was in me. I never even dreamed this sin was in me. But it was there. And I did it. And I'm sorry. And I need to get help. But as long as you're covering up, as long as you're walking around like everything's okay, you're not going to get it right. And you're going to walk around with your bones broken on the inside. You're going to walk around with a dirty heart. And you're going to walk around with a bad spirit. And the only thing that'll fix that is getting right with God. Thank you.